The train rocked gently beneath Clara Hayes as she stared out the window, watching the endless stretch of golden prairie roll past. The world outside seemed wide and free, but inside her heart there was only the trembling weight of uncertainty. Everything she had ever known, the narrow streets of Philadelphia, the gray boarding house where she'd worked for years, the cold looks of men who found her too plain to notice, was now behind her. Ahead lay the unknown, a man she had never met, a life she could barely imagine, and a promise written in neat, careful handwriting. The letter from Daniel Reed lay folded in her lap, worn soft from all the times she'd read it. I seek a practical woman, someone honest, hardworking, and willing to build a life on the land. Those words had seemed like salvation when she first saw them in the newspaper. No one had ever asked for her before. Clara wasn't beautiful like her sisters, nor quick with laughter, but she was steady and gentle, and she believed, perhaps foolishly, that there might still be a corner of the world where she belonged. Outside the window, the landscape grew wilder. Hills gave way to plains, and plains to open skies so vast they seemed to swallow the sun. Clara pressed her hand to the glass and whispered a prayer under her breath. She wasn't sure if she was asking for courage or forgiveness. When the train stopped at the small town of Clearwater, she stepped down onto the platform clutching her carpetbag. The wind was sharp with dust and sagebrush, and the station was little more than a shack with a single bench. Men in work shirts loaded supplies onto wagons. Women passed by with baskets and children. No one looked her way. Then she saw him. Daniel Reed stood by a bay horse tied to a post, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. He looked older than she expected, perhaps 35, with sun-browned skin and eyes that seemed to carry both strength and weariness. His clothes were plain, his hat pulled low, and when their gazes met, she felt a strange jolt of nerves. He walked toward her with a careful, measured step. "Miss Hayes?" She nodded quickly, her hands twisting together. "Yes, Mr. Reed. It's an honor to finally meet you." He tipped his hat politely, but his expression didn't soften. "You had a long ride. I'll get your bag." There was no smile, no welcome, just courtesy, distant and cool. Clara followed him to the wagon, trying not to let the ache rise in her chest. The road from the station was rough, lined with tumbleweed and fences half broken by wind. The silence between them stretched like the plains themselves. She tried to make small talk. "It's beautiful here," he nodded. "Takes getting used to." She glanced at him, studying the strong line of his jaw, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. He wasn't unkind, just guarded, as though life had taught him to expect disappointment. When the ranch finally came into view, the sky had turned to gold and rose. The house stood at the edge of the fields, sturdy but lonely against the vast horizon. A single light glowed in the window. Clara's heart gave a small leap. Someone was inside. A child. From the porch, a little girl peeked out, her small hand gripping the doorframe. Her dark hair fell in soft waves, her eyes wide and watchful. Daniel's voice softened slightly when he saw her. "That's Lydia." Clara smiled nervously and waved, but the girl disappeared inside without a word. As the sun dipped below the hills, Clara stepped onto the porch of what was now to be her new home. The boards creaked beneath her feet, the air smelled of rain and earth, and for the first time since she'd left the East, she felt the weight of her choice. She had come west to marry a stranger, but standing there in the quiet, she couldn't help but wonder if the stranger was lonelier than she was. The morning sun rose over the Reed Ranch in a pale wash of gold, but the warmth didn't reach Clara's heart. She stood by the kitchen window, clutching a chipped cup of coffee, watching Daniel saddle his horse in the yard. He moved with quiet precision, his broad frame outlined against the pale sky, every motion practiced and sure. It struck her that this man didn't need anyone, least of all her. Their wedding had been a brief, practical affair the evening before. The local preacher had come by after supper, said a few words, and left as quickly as he arrived. No music, no flowers, no kiss. Daniel had thanked her politely afterward, as though sealing a business arrangement. Then he had gone to the barn, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the silent little girl who watched from the shadows. Now, as Clara watched him ride off toward the north pasture, she felt the heavy stillness of the house settle around her. The walls creaked, the clock ticked, and dust drifted lazily in the beams of sunlight. It wasn't the home she'd imagined. It smelled faintly of old leather, wood, smoke, and loneliness. Determined not to let despair take root, she set to work. She washed the dishes, swept the floors, and unpacked her modest belongings. A worn Bible, a few dresses, a faded photograph of her parents. Each small task steadied her hands, but not her heart. Every sound seemed too loud, every silence too deep. At midday, she tried to speak with Lydia. The little girl sat under the oak tree by the fence, knees pulled to her chest, a doll clasped in her hands. Clara approached softly. "That's a lovely doll," she said, kneeling beside her. "Did your papa make her for you?" The girl didn't answer. She just stared at the doll, her small mouth pressed in a line. Clara waited, but the silence stretched on, broken only by the whisper of the wind. Finally, Lydia stood and walked away, her small boots crunching in the dust. Clara stayed there for a long time, staring at the empty space where the child had been. She understood that kind of silence. She had lived it her whole life. Unspoken hurts, quiet rejections, the ache of being unwanted. When Daniel returned that evening, he looked surprised to find supper waiting. Clara had prepared stew and fresh bread, her way of showing gratitude. But when he sat down, he only nodded curtly. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble," he said. "It's no trouble," she replied softly. It's what a wife should do." He looked up at her then, his eyes steady but unreadable. "I didn't marry you for duties, Miss Hayes. I just needed help, someone to look after Lydia and the house. I don't expect more than that." The words landed like a stone in her chest. "Miss Hayes, not Clara, not my wife." She managed a small smile, though her throat tightened painfully. "Of course, I understand." But she didn't, not really. When Lydia appeared in the doorway, Daniel's face softened for the first time. "You should be in bed," he told her gently. The girl nodded, but didn't move. Her eyes lingered on Clara, cautious and curious. Then she turned and padded back to her room. After the dishes were cleared, Daniel stepped outside to smoke his pipe. Clara watched him through the window, his figure framed by moonlight and the whispering grass. He looked like a man carved from stone, strong, quiet, unreachable. Inside, she sat alone by the hearth, listening to the wind brush against the shutters. She thought of the letter that had brought her here, the promise of a new life, of belonging. And for the first time since stepping off the train, she wondered if she had traded one kind of loneliness for another. But deep inside, a small voice refused to give up. Maybe kindness could melt the ice around his heart. Maybe patience could bring laughter back into that silent house. She didn't know how, but she knew she had to try. The days slipped quietly into one another, marked by the sound of creaking porch boards, the soft clatter of dishes, and the lonely cry of a mourning dove at dusk. Clara had begun to learn the rhythms of the Reed Ranch: the early rising, the long hours of tending to chores, the quiet suppers, where Daniel spoke little and Lydia spoke not at all. Every morning, Clara tried to make the kitchen a place of warmth. She baked biscuits and brewed coffee strong enough to wake even the sleepiest cowboy. But Daniel always ate quickly, nodding his thanks before heading out to the fields. Lydia, small and pale in her faded dress, sat across from Clara in silence, her big brown eyes fixed on the plate, but never on the woman who served it. A tea first. Clara thought the girl simply shy. But as days turned into weeks, she realized Lydia's silence was something deeper, a wound, invisible but real. Daniel never spoke of it, and Clara, too gentle to pry, only wondered. One afternoon, while sweeping the porch, she saw Lydia sitting under the great oak tree at the edge of the yard, the same place she always went. The child's small shoulders hunched forward as she drew circles in the dirt with a stick. Clara hesitated, then carried a basket of fresh bread and sat down nearby. "The air's cooler today," she said softly, laying the basket beside her. "That means autumn's coming soon. I always loved the fall." The trees back east would turn all shades of gold and red. It looked like the whole world was catching fire. The girl didn't look up, but her hand stilled. Clara smiled faintly. "Would you like some bread? I added honey this time. I think it makes everything taste sweeter." A few long seconds passed. Then, slowly, Oya reached out a small hand and took a piece. She didn't say a word, but she didn't walk away either. To Clara, it felt like the first fragile crack in a wall she had been gently pressing against since the day she arrived. That evening, she mentioned it to Daniel. She took the bread, Clara said quietly as they stood by the sink, drying dishes together. Did she ever speak much before? Daniel's shoulders stiffened. She used to. Before her mother passed. The room went still. Clara set down the plate in her hands. I'm so sorry, he nodded, his face shadowed. It's been 2 years. The doctor said she might talk again someday, but he trailed off, his gaze drifting toward the darkened hallway where Lydia's small footsteps had disappeared moments before. Clara wanted to reach for him, to say something, anything to bridge the ache she heard in his voice, but the words stuck in her throat. So instead, she whispered, maybe she just needs time, and a little kindness. That night, Clara sat by her small window, looking out across the moonlit fields. She thought of Lydia's wide eyes, of the way grief could hollow out even the smallest hearts. She knew that feeling too well, the kind of loneliness that made speaking feel useless. The next morning, Clara left a small bouquet of wildflowers on Lydia's windowsill. No note, no words, just color and scent. That afternoon, she found the flowers tucked carefully into a cup of water on the kitchen table. It wasn't much, but it was something. A few days later, Lydia followed Clara into the garden without a word, watching as she pulled weeds and hummed softly. When Clara looked up, she caught a faint flicker of a smile before the girl turned away. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, hope took root inside Clara. Lydia's silence was no longer frightening, it was sacred, like the hush before dawn, and Clara made herself a quiet promise. She would wait as long as it took for that little voice to return. By the time autumn brushed the plains with strokes of gold and rust, a quiet rhythm had found its way into life at the Reed Ranch. The air smelled of hay and wood smoke, and the days were shorter, gentler. Clara worked alongside Daniel now, not because he asked her to, but because the silence between them was slowly softening. Like frost melting in morning sun, Daniel still spoke little, but he no longer avoided her eyes. Sometimes, at breakfast, she caught him watching her hands as she kneaded bread or stitched Lydia's torn dresses. Once, he even smiled, small, fleeting, but real, and it stayed with her all day like the warmth of a fire she couldn't quite forget. Lydia had begun to follow Clara almost everywhere. The girl didn't speak, but she listened. When Clara hummed while sweeping, Lydia would sit cross-legged on the floor, her doll in her lap, head tilted as though memorizing the tune. When Clara read softly from her worn Bible in the evenings, the child would curl on the rug by her feet, her eyelids fluttering closed. It was on one such evening, as the wind moaned softly outside, that Clara caught Daniel lingering in the doorway. He was watching them, his daughter, peaceful for once, and the woman who had somehow brought light back into his home. For a heartbeat, Clara saw something in his eyes, gratitude, yes, but also a longing he didn't yet understand. When he realized she'd noticed him, he cleared his throat and stepped fully into the room. Fire's burning low, he said, his tone awkward. I'll add another log, she murmured, rising quickly. Embarrassed by the sudden heat in her cheeks. As she bent to stir the fire, Daniel crouched beside her. Their hands brushed on the hearthstone, just a brief, accidental touch, but it sent a spark through them both. Clara looked up, startled, and found his gaze waiting for hers. For a moment, neither moved. Then Lydia stirred in her sleep, and the spell broke. Daniel stood, muttering something about checking the barn, and Clara sat back, heart pounding, unsure whether to smile or cry. The next day brought the first frost of the season. Daniel was out repairing a fence when a splinter gashed his palm. Clara found him in the barn, trying to bandage it himself with a strip of torn cloth. Let me help, she said firmly, reaching for his hand. It's fine, he protested. But she was already wrapping the wound with clean linen, her fingers gentle but sure. You should take better care of yourself, she said softly, eyes focused on the task. A rancher's no good to anyone if he's half broken. He chuckled, a quiet, rusty sound, as though laughter was something he hadn't used in a while. "You sound like someone who's been patching up trouble all her life." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I have." Their eyes met, and the air between them shifted again, warmer, closer. He didn't pull his hand away until she was finished, and even then, the memory of her touch lingered like a whisper. That night, after Lydia went to bed, Clara sat by the fire sewing a new dress for the child. Daniel sat nearby, mending a bridle. For once, the silence between them didn't feel heavy, it felt comfortable, companionable. Every now and then, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a question, a possibility. Outside, the wind brushed softly through the prairie grass, carrying the scent of pine and promise. Clara didn't dare name the feeling growing in her chest, not yet, but she knew it was real. For the first time in years, the walls of her heart were beginning to crack, and she had a feeling Daniel's were too. The storm came without warning, rolling across the plains like an angry wave of darkness. By dusk, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters and driving rain against the windows. The horses in the barn cried out, hooves striking the floor in panic. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard it, the sharp, frightened whinny of a horse and the low rumble of thunder that followed. Daniel was still out mending a fence near the southern pasture. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and rushed into the storm. The rain was cold, stinging her face as she fought her way across the yard. The barn doors banged against the wind, and when she pushed them open, the smell of hay and fear filled the air. The mare, Belle, was thrashing in her stall, her eyes wide and rolling. Clara spoke softly, her voice trembling but calm. Girl, easy now." She reached out, letting the horse smell her hand, then stroked its neck. Lightning flashed, turning the world white for a heartbeat. The animal jerked again, nearly striking her, but Clara stood her ground. Slowly, her soothing voice and steady touch began to quiet the frightened creature. Then she heard a sound, a tiny gasp behind her. Turning, she saw Lydia, barefoot and drenched, standing in the doorway. Her nightdress clung to her small frame, her eyes round with terror. "Lydia!" Clara cried, rushing to her. "You shouldn't be out here, it's not safe." The child didn't move. She looked at the trembling horse, then back at Clara, her lips quivering. Another bolt of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. The mare kicked hard against the stall, and Lydia screamed a raw, frightened sound and ran straight into Clara's arms. Clara knelt, holding her close, feeling the child's heart hammering against her chest. "It's all right, sweetheart. It's all right. I've got you." Lydia buried her face in Clara's neck, sobbing so hard her small body shook. Clara rocked her gently, humming a lullaby through the noise of the storm, the same soft tune she'd sung every evening. Then, through the storm's roar and the horse's restless stamping, she felt a warm breath near her ear and heard it, faint, trembling, but clear. "Can you be my mommy?" The words were so quiet, Clara almost thought she imagined them. But Lydia's small voice quivered again, certain this time, broken with tears. "Please, can you be my mommy?" Clara froze, her heart breaking and healing all at once. For 2 years, this child had spoken to no one, locked inside silence and sorrow, and now she was whispering to her. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she hugged the girl tighter. "Oh, my love," she whispered back. "Yes, yes, I can." She didn't know Daniel had returned. He stood in the doorway, rain streaming from his hat, his breath catching as he watched the scene before him, Clara cradling his daughter, the child's face pressed to her shoulder, her lips moving softly in words long lost. For the first time in 2 years, Lydia's silence had been broken. Daniel's chest ached with something too strong to name. Gratitude, guilt, hope. He stepped forward slowly, afraid that any sound might shatter the fragile magic before him. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze through her tears. She spoke. Clara whispered, her voice shaking. Daniel knelt beside them, his eyes glistening. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Lydia's face, his hand trembling. "I heard." For a long while, the three of them stayed there on the barn floor, huddled together while the storm raged outside. And though thunder still rolled across the plains, inside that small circle of warmth and love, Something even stronger stirred, something that felt like the beginning of healing. The storm passed, leaving the air cool and clean, the earth rich with the scent of rain. By morning, the ranch looked softer somehow, as if the land itself had sighed in relief. But the true change was inside the house. For the first time in years, laughter echoed through its walls. Lydia's voice, small and sweet, floated like music through the rooms. She spoke shyly at first, just single words: Papa, horse, Clara. Each one was a miracle. Daniel could hardly look at her without his throat tightening. He dreamed of hearing her voice again, but he'd never dared to hope. And it was Clara, the quiet woman who had come from nowhere, who'd made it happen. From that day on, the ranch felt different. Lydia followed Clara everywhere now, helping her hang laundry, feed the chickens, and knead bread in the mornings. Clara taught her to hum songs while they worked. And sometimes the two of them would burst into laughter at some small mishap, the kind that once would have gone unnoticed. Daniel would pause in his chores just to listen, leaning on a fence post, with a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The sound of their laughter filled the spaces his wife's absence had once hollowed out. One evening, Clara found him repairing the corral fence and walked out to bring him a cup of coffee. The setting sun burned low on the horizon, painting everything in soft amber light. "You've done so much for her," he said quietly, without looking up. Clara shook her head. "I haven't done anything special. Lydia just needed someone to listen. Sometimes love doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to stay." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the wind lifting a loose strand of her hair, her eyes gentle and steady. "You've given her back her voice," he said. "And maybe you've given me back something too." She smiled, but it trembled slightly. "And what's that?" "Hope," he said simply. Something inside her chest ached in the sweetest way. The words lingered between them like the golden light of dusk, soft, unspoken, full of meaning. That night, after Lydia had gone to bed, Clara sat by the fire mending Daniel's shirt. He watched her from his chair, his heart heavy with things he didn't know how to say. His wife, Anna, had been gone for 2 years, and the grief had built walls around him so high he'd forgotten how to climb down. But Clara, quiet, kind, patient Clara, had found the door and opened it without force. He cleared his throat. "I know I wasn't kind when you first came here," he began. "I didn't mean to make you feel unwelcome." Clara looked up. Needle paused in midair. "You were grieving," she said softly. "I understood." Still, he shook his head. "I thought I was doing what was best for Lydia. I didn't think she or I could handle someone new. But now," his voice faltered, "now, can't imagine this place without you." Clara's breath caught. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, and outside, a coyote called in the distance. She lowered her gaze. "You don't have to say that, Daniel. I'm not saying it out of pity," he said, his voice rough. "I'm saying it because it's true." Her fingers trembled over the fabric. She wanted to believe him, wanted it more than she could admit, but fear whispered in her heart that this peace couldn't last. A woman like her was easy to overlook, easy to forget. Still, when Daniel took the shirt from her hands and their fingers brushed, she didn't pull away. The warmth that passed between them felt like something new, something fragile and alive. In that moment, Clara realized the truth. She was no longer just a mail-order bride. She was becoming part of something real, a family stitched together by loss, love, and the courage to begin again. The first snow came early that year, drifting softly over the plains like a promise of silence. Inside the Reed Ranch, the fire burned steady, filling the rooms with warmth and the faint scent of pine. Clara stood by the window, watching the flakes melt against the glass, her heart heavier than she could explain. For weeks now, she tried to ignore the whisper inside her, the one that told her she didn't belong here. Daniel had been kind, gentler with every passing day, and Lydia had become her shadow, her little heartbeat of joy. But kindness, Clara told herself, wasn't love. And she feared that someday Daniel would wake up and realize he'd never truly wanted her, that she'd only filled a space left empty by grief. It began with small things. A look she couldn't read in his eyes. A silence that felt heavier than before. Once, at the market, she'd overheard 2 women whispering behind her, "Poor thing. The rancher's wife is still fresh in the ground." and he's already brought another. She's just a mail-order bride. Bless her heart. He'll never love her like the first one. The words clung to her like burrs she couldn't shake. That night, when Daniel smiled across the dinner table, she smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. By candlelight, she began to write. Dear Daniel, when I came here, I was lost. You gave me a home. Lydia gave me purpose. I will always be grateful. But I know now that you didn't ask for me, you asked for help. And I've stayed long enough to see your hearts begin to heal. It's time I go find my own. Please tell Lydia that I love her more than words can say. Clara folded the letter and set it on the kitchen table beside the lamp. Her hands trembled as she packed her few belongings, the same small carpetbag she'd carried off the train, now worn at the corners. The house was dark and quiet, except for the faint ticking of the clock and the soft sound of snow brushing against the window panes. She paused at Lydia's doorway. The little girl was asleep, curled beneath a patchwork quilt, her doll tucked in her arms. Clara brushed a kiss against her forehead. I love you, she whispered, more than you'll ever know. By dawn, she was gone. When Daniel woke, the house felt strangely empty. The smell of breakfast was missing, the fire burned low, and Lydia's laughter, so often the first sound of the morning, didn't come. Then he saw the letter. He read it once, twice, his heart hammering harder with each line. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. She's gone, Papa. Lydia's small voice broke the silence. She stood in the doorway, blinking her eyes, still half dreaming. Where's Clara? Daniel tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Lydia looked around the kitchen, her gaze landing on the letter, and something in her face changed. Her lip trembled. She's not gone, she whispered. She wouldn't leave me. When Daniel knelt to comfort her, she jerked away, tears streaming down her face. You made her go, she cried, her voice shaking but clear. You never told her you loved her. Daniel froze. It was the first time Lydia had spoken so many words at once, and everyone cut straight through him. Within minutes, he was saddling his horse. The snow was falling thick now, the wind sharp as glass, but he didn't feel the cold. Lydia's voice echoed in his ears, her plea, her pain, her truth. He spurred the horse into motion, his heart pounding in rhythm with the gallop. The letter was still in his coat pocket, its edges damp from his grip. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not after she'd mended everything he thought was broken beyond repair. He rode toward the open plains, the trail vanishing beneath the snow, his eyes searching the white horizon for the woman who had come west to marry a stranger and instead had given him back his soul. The wind cut cold across the open plains, swirling snow into the air like ghosts of the past. Daniel leaned low over his horse's neck, his coat soaked through, his breath turning to mist. The world was white and endless, but he didn't slow, not when his heart thundered louder than the storm, not when the trail disappeared beneath the snow. He had lost one woman to death. He would not lose another to fear. At last, through the haze of falling snow, he saw her, a small, dark figure trudging along the road, clutching her carpetbag against her chest. Clara. Her shawl was soaked, her steps uneven, but she didn't turn when he called her name. Only when his horse drew close and he leapt down did she finally stop, her shoulders stiff, her head bowed. Clara? His voice cracked, rough with wind and emotion. What in God's name are you doing out here? She turned slowly, her face pale beneath the snowflakes clinging to her lashes. I was going to town. I thought I might find work there. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. You don't have to come after me, Daniel. You've done enough. He stepped closer, snow crunching under his boots. Enough? He let out a breath that came out like a laugh, sharp, aching. You think giving my daughter her voice again was enough? You think bringing life back into that house was enough? Clara shook her head, clutching her bag tighter. You don't understand. I was never meant to stay. You needed someone for the chores. For Lydia and I. Her voice broke. I was foolish to hope for more. Daniel reached for her, but she stepped back. I heard what people say in town, she whispered, that you'll never love anyone the way you loved your wife. I can't live as a ghost beside her memory. For a moment, all he could do was stare at her, his breath fogging between them. Then he said, quietly, but with conviction, they're right. I won't ever love anyone the same way. But that's because love isn't something that replaces, it grows. It changes shape. It makes room. Her eyes filled, her lips trembling. Daniel. He took another step, closing the space between them. Clara Hayes, you came here a stranger and built a home out of ashes. You taught my little girl to laugh again. You taught me to live again. Don't you see? You're not a replacement. You're a miracle. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You shouldn't say things you don't mean. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. Then tell me this, do you think I'd be out here in the freezing snow chasing a woman I didn't love? Her lips parted, but no words came. The wind howled around them, carrying his words away into the white silence. Then he took her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. Come home, Clara, he whispered. Not as a helper, not as a mail-order bride. As my wife, my heart, Lydia's mother. She let out a broken laugh, half sob, half relief. You're sure? I've never been surer of anything in my life. The carpetbag slipped from her fingers and landed softly in the snow. She threw her arms around him, and he held her close, feeling her warmth against the cold, her heartbeat steady against his chest. For the first time in years, everything felt right. When they rode back together through the snowfall, Clara leaned against him, her head resting beneath his chin. The ranch lights glowed like stars in the distance. Lydia was waiting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, her small face lighting up when she saw them. She ran through the snow, shouting, Clara, you came back. Clara knelt, catching the girl in her arms, tears and laughter mingling as Lydia clung to her neck. Daniel stood behind them, his heart full to the brim. Later that night, by the fire's glow, Lydia fell asleep on Clara's lap while Daniel took her hand. No words were needed, their hearts had already spoken. Clara had come west to marry a stranger, but what she found instead was a home built not from wood or stone, but from love, gentle, patient, and everlasting.